Welcome, everyone. This is the second of our three-part series on racism in America webinar series. Good evening. My name is Sherry Goldberg, and I'm chair of the Community Relations Committee of the Jewish Federation of Greater Metro West. It is my privilege to welcome you to the second of our three-part series, developed by our Community Relations Committee with guidance from Rabbi Cliff Colwin, Rabbi Emeritus of Temple B'nai Abraham in Livingston, and Rabbi Elliot Tepperman of B'nai Keshet in Montclair. Tonight's webinar, entitled Understanding Today, will look at racism through the eyes of four Black leaders, neighbors, and fellow citizens of the state of New Jersey. Many of us see the killing of George Floyd as a watershed moment in our country, a time for every individual, institution, business, and nonprofit to think about ways that we can work to bring about societal justice and racial equality. But first, we need to listen and learn. Rabbi Tepperman will introduce our distinguished panel and serve as moderator. At about 8:15, we'll be opening the floor for questions, which we ask you to please submit in the Q&A function on this Zoom. There are over 200 people on tonight's webinar, which shows the degree to which this issue has struck a nerve in our community. We'll do our best to get as many questions as possible. Once again, thank you for joining us. Rabbi Tepperman will now introduce our distinguished panel.
Good evening, and thank you, Sherry. It is very much an honor to be moderating this discussion, and I want to, on behalf of the Jewish Federation of Greater Metro West, express my gratitude. As I'm sure all of the panelists that are joining us tonight are aware, the Jewish community is indeed very diverse. And while many white Jews and Jews of color in our community have long been actively working to pursue an anti-racist vision, there are also many who have only since the killing of George Floyd begun to seriously investigate the racist systems enshrined in so many of our institutions. So I really want to thank you for agreeing to take the time to deepen our understanding of those systems of racism, systems that have long been only too well known by Black Americans living under them. To our many listeners, whether you are longtime civil rights activists or newly engaged in understanding racism, whether you're a conservative or progressive, whether you are eagerly interested or hesitant and skeptical, I want to thank you for showing up. So I want to take a moment now and introduce our panelists. We have Lisa Asari, who is the Assistant Commissioner of the Division of Family Health Services in the New Jersey Department of Health, where she has worked for the past 20 years. She was appointed Assistant Commissioner in 2016. Welcome, Lisa. We have Jim Johnson, Chief Lawyer for the City of New York and former federal prosecutor and Assistant Secretary of the Treasury and also a Montclair native. So welcome very much. Great to have you, Jim. It's also my pleasure to welcome Petal Robertson, President of the Montclair Education Association. She's also a teacher at Montclair High School, where she has taught English, African American literature, civics, and government. Pleasure to have you here. Finally, it is my great pleasure to welcome Reverend Terry Richardson, Head Minister of First Baptist Church of South Orange. So nice to have you all here. Again, to our many listeners, I want to make sure you know, because I already know, that all of these panelists have come to this conversation as tremendous allies of the Jewish community. Before we began our conversation tonight, they each were invited, I've invited each of them to speak directly so as to maximize our understanding of their experiences and their expertise. And I want to tell you that I am less concerned tonight that this Zoom gathering be a safe space than I am that it be a brave space. So as listeners, I'm inviting you to be brave listeners. Finally, I'll just say that one of the great challenges of moderating a discussion is that, like this one, is that we have such an extraordinary caliber and expertise from our speakers. We could easily spend the whole evening with any one of them. And while I'm going to begin this conversation with specific questions in mind related to their expertise, I want to make sure you know and they know that I'm very eager to hear their personal experiences of racism and, or for that matter, any reflections you might have on this moment and its history. So you should feel free to bring that into the conversation wherever it seems appropriate. So without any further introduction, I'd like to begin with the first question to Jim. And Jim, I'd like to ask you, you've been examining the widening chasm between police and the Black community for decades. And you wrote a piece for the Washington Post in 2016 that talked about the urgency of finding solutions for policing communities before additional killings deepen the societal divide. You've chaired an advisory committee in New Jersey that looked into policing standards in our state. So I really want to ask for your reflections and to understand the degree to which you think anything has changed here that can serve as a model for the rest of the country.
Well, thanks a lot, first for having all of us. This is a very important conversation and really one of a set of conversations we need to keep having. So before I became involved in law enforcement, I was a kid here in Montclair. And my first engagement actually with issues around policing and racial profiling was driving on Grove Street with my older brother in our family car when we were stopped for driving in a stolen car. Again, before I got involved in law enforcement in Montclair on Bloomfield Avenue, I was searched because the rug that I was carrying appeared to the officer to contain a rifle, notwithstanding the fact that I was 150 feet in front of Bilderian Brothers cleaners, rug cleaners. And so from a fairly early age, not only from my own experience, but as I was advised about how I should conduct myself, I was concerned about law enforcement, which begs the question, why did I become involved? Why did I become an assistant secretary or assistant U.S. attorney and ultimately rising to the ranks of undersecretary of the Treasury, overseeing a third of federal law enforcement? Because I believed that change was possible, and I felt that I could be part of the change. In recent years, I have worked, I was the chair of New Jersey's Advisory Committee on Police Standards that was examining whether or not the state troopers had made sufficient progress under a consent decree to deal with issues of driving while Black. In recent years, very recent years, I helped form a group called New Jersey Communities Forward, which decided to do something a little bit different. We practiced, we developed and we practiced a methodology of engaging in police community. We worked with law enforcement. I was on the outside very much. We worked with law enforcement to help New Jersey become one of the first states with a body-worn camera policy, one of the first states where implicit bias training was given to police officers. These were important things. And so some of the things that we've done in terms of community engagement can definitely be replicated and carried out across the nation. And it's happening right now. But what's really important and why this convening is so important is that we can't make progress on these issues unless all people are engaged, unless we all decide not to outsource responsibility for judgment, for justice, but instead take it on ourselves.
I hesitate to jump off track so soon, but first thing, I just have to observe that the experience that you shared of being stopped while being Black in Montclair is one that I've heard over and over again from people I know in the community who are Black and are African American. And I think it is often shocking for white suburbanites in New Jersey or throughout Metro West to realize, no, that's not happening someplace else. That's happening here too. So I appreciate you starting us off with that. I think it's important for people to hear. I wanted to pick up though on the last thing you said. What are the steps that you see us taking? Are you When you say that we might want to be replicating some of the things that happen in New Jersey in terms of implicit bias and some of the other things that you mentioned, the training, do we want to be advocating for that on a federal level, or do you want to see some other kind of action happening here in New Jersey that would be a further model for other places?
You know, one of the people I admire most right now, and many people admire him, is Brian Stevenson, and he talks about the need for justice to be proximate. So while it is important to advocate on the federal level, and who's in the White House matters, we have most of the impact between law enforcement and the communities they serve is local. And Brian Stevenson talks about the importance of proximity. And when I've spoken about it in New Jersey, because it's New Jersey, I say that justice is a context for it, which means that we do have to be close. And so advocating for more dialogue, for more training, for greater diversity within law enforcement, all of these things are important. But also, and this may be the most important thing, changing the narrative about what the expectation is of law enforcement, between law enforcement and all members of the communities that they serve. Moving from the idea that essentially they are, this is long since past, a warrior mentality to a guardian mentality. I would say take it one step further. Let's think about justice and public safety as being co-created. And so we want law enforcement to consider themselves part of the communities they serve rather than apart from them.
Thank you. One other question before we move on. You have also written about the health effects on people of color that are brought about by this often fractious relationship between police officers and the communities they serve. I'm quoting, "The environment of anger and distrust leaves many African American and Latino children manifesting symptoms of stress and trauma akin to those who've lived in war zones." And you say that many police officers are also suffering from some of the same stresses and trauma. So could you say more about how you understand this as a public health issue?
Well, when I wrote that, I was focused specifically on the murder of 8 police officers in Dallas, Texas, and the assailant said that he was motivated by killings of African Americans. But to understand and move forward, we have to understand police, and we have to understand communities on a very human level. That doesn't mean that one can make a balance between the two. Law enforcement is held to a higher standard than members of the community, but one needs to really understand what's going on for many children, particularly at a time, it's no longer the case in New York, but when stop and frisk was highly prevalent, and there were kids headed to school who worried as much about dealing with law enforcement as they were dealing with everyone, dealing with those in their communities who might do violence to them, particularly gangs. That was a real problem for young people. Today, we still need to focus on levels of trauma. We have a public health expert on this call, so I'm not going to go too far into that zone. But it's not just the police contact that leads to a weathering among Black and brown children and adults, but it is the various ways that our system has an impact on their health chances. Thank you.
Well, with that, I think I'm going to turn to Lisa Asari, our public health expert. And Lisa, I know that a lot of the current debate and discussion has been focused on policing and on criminal justice systems, but that it's just true that systemic racism has permeated all sectors of our society. So Lisa, I was hoping you could explain for us some of the disparities that exist in the healthcare systems and how they've created different outcomes for Black people.
Sure. So thanks for having me, and thanks for the reference to the public health professional. I'll do my best to be that. But I think it's important sometimes just to sort of level set and give you a sense of the disparities. We talk about health disparities and sort of what do they mean. So I'm just going to go through a couple bullets that I keep on my person. The average life expectancy for Blacks in New Jersey is 3 years less than their white counterparts. and 15 years less than their Asian counterparts. African Americans die at disproportionately higher rates for 8 out of 10 of the leading causes. Kidney disease, diabetes were 2 times more likely to die, 21 times more likely to die from HIV, 12 times more likely to die from homicide. And when you look at a Black baby born in the city of Trenton, that child can look to live to 74 years of age, while a white baby born 12 miles away in Princeton can live 14 years longer and expect to live to 87. And so I say that just to give you a sense of the disparities that we're talking about in terms of health outcomes.
And I know that one of your areas of expertise is family health, including maternal health. Could you maybe use that as an example to give us some understanding of why the mortality rates for Black women and infants is so much higher?
Sure, absolutely. And I think of what we saw with George Floyd and what we see with police brutality. This is stuff that we see in the event that it's on tape. Some of the things that happen in sort of labor and delivery or in the sort of maternal space, we don't see as vividly. A Black infant is 3 times more likely not to make it to its first birthday than the white counterpart. And a Black woman is 5 times more likely to die from pregnancy-related complication than her white counterpart. And I think what is most startling about some of these statistics is even when you control for things like education and income, when you look at Black women's health outcomes, a Black woman with a college degree has a worse possibility of having a bad outcome than a white woman with a high school diploma. And so when you ask Rabbi, what is driving this, the factors are so complex, but we have spent some time looking at them to really get a sense. There's certainly issues around health conditions, chronic condition and chronic illness, but there's also implicit bias. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the story about Serena Williams. She's a celebrity. She had a baby. I see her baby on the tennis court with her now. The baby's not so much a baby, but when she had the baby, she was experiencing some real health issues, but no one would listen to her. So I think the story goes, if you're Serena Williams and you're in the hospital having a baby and people won't listen to you, imagine if you were Lisa Asari or somebody who's lesser known. I think there's some implicit bias in the healthcare system. There are some surgical procedures that shouldn't be happening at the same frequency. And what we hear a lot is that Black women are just not listened to. There's a perception that we experience pain differently than other people. There's been many cases where you could just see people were not listened to enough, or really respected or given respectful maternity care. So when I heard my co-panelist, Jim Johnson, talking about implicit bias training for police, we're doing this in the healthcare setting because it's really important that people understand that we all come with a bias, but the bias should not impact the care that you may provide to someone. And so we're spending quite a bit of time in New Jersey around these adverse birth outcomes and really looking to make New Jersey the safest place to give birth in the country, but really looking to make having a baby a wonderful experience that people shouldn't be fearful of.
Thanks a lot, Lisa. I appreciate it. And I want to direct the next question to Petal Robertson. Petal, we know that disparities in education and access to higher education have created very different opportunities for Black and white people. I know, Petal, that you've taught in the Montclair school system, and you have been able to point out inequalities that can begin where students live or even where they catch the bus, and that often extend to bigger issues like how public funds are allocated in the school system. I was hoping you could just spend a little bit of time breaking that down for us and helping us to understand some of the systemic racist issues that are involved in education right now.
Sure. So I'll do my best quick teacher way. I think the thing about systemic racism is that it is a little difficult to understand because it's like a spider web. And there's so many different aspects that are intertwined in it, especially when we're talking about education. So a lot of times when we have conversations about racism in education, they focus heavily on individual acts of racism, which are harmful, which are terrible, but we can pluck those out and you still at your structure can have a racist institution. So when we talk about structural racism, we're talking about practices, policies, norms, representation, which at their very foundation, at the very foundation of the institute, perpetuate racism. So if we think like policies, for instance, our discipline policies, a district would have to take a look at their discipline policies and see how do those discipline policies disproportionately affect students of color. For example, if you have a discipline policy or a code of conduct that says disrespect can earn you a detention. Well, what's disrespect to me and what's disrespect to somebody else might look very different. But when we start to take a look at our statistics, how many students are getting sent out of class for so-called disrespect? How many students, and when we take a look at some of our practices, our curriculum practices, when we think about the structural racism in our practices, we have a curriculum, not just in Montclair, but across the country. We have a curriculum that is riddled with implicit bias, right? We have a curriculum that sends an unconscious message to Black kids and to students of color that they are less than. And when we think about how, so when we talk about structural racism, it's in the how. So if you look at an English course, they're predominantly white authors. When we teach about Black history, we often start with slavery, right? We don't teach Black students that they come from kings and queens. We talk about slavery, we talk about civil rights. We somehow wind the story of their existence into stories of oppression. While we teach white victory often. When we teach white victory when the authors we read are all white. We teach white victory when the stories we tell, whether they be in a math class, science class, English class, those are all those subliminal messages that we give to kids. And that at its very structure is something that we would need to change about our system, particularly in Montclair, but overall. When we think about it, Montclair has definitely taken some great strides in terms of incorporating an African-American lit course, which I was very happy to be able to teach for a long time. But therein still, that brings about the discussion of diversity versus inclusion, right? So diversity is still how we pluck at individual racism, but inclusion is how we fight structural racism. So diversity means that I have a course called African-American Lit. Inclusion means that I don't need to have a course called African American Lit because I'm teaching literature, classic literature from Black authors intertwined with my English class, because it's just as important as every other AP author. I'm teaching Black history because I recognize how it ties into the history of the United States, and I'm teaching it in its authenticity. Those would be aspects of structural racism. And when we think about just some things that are just our norms, what are some of our policies and practices that we've been doing for so long and haven't recognized how they can adversely affect Black children and students of color? So you mentioned busing and transportation. Something as slight as where you live can affect your education if you are a student of color. So for instance, you can get a bus if you live in certain parts of Montclair, but certain aspects of the 4th Ward can't access a bus. And while that might not sound like a lot, it's a financial toll, because that parent now has to be able to come up with the bus fare for their child to get to school every day, or that child has to somehow make it to school every day, whether that be rain, sleet, or snow, like a postman, right? They have to figure out how are they gonna get to school every day in that weather, not the sidewalk to door drop off. And the differences that we have in our policies is that if a school assigned bus is late, you don't get a detention, you get excused, you get to go to class. If a community bus is late, you get a detention. You can't just go straight to class. And think about how we start our day. What if you had to start your day after walking almost 2 miles in the snow to get to your destination? How do you start your first period? And all of those are, and that's just an example of some of the little things, the little disparities that we have. But you also have to think about social capital. Social capital is also another norm. Who has access to the superintendent? Who has access to board members? Who has access to be able to stake their claim? And that's not, a lot of the times, that's not our Black families. That's not our immigrant families coming in. So their their needs can often go unheard, and not even purposely all the time, but ignored because that's not the parent that you're going to see in the middle of the day in your office if something happens to their child. That's not the parent that necessarily is going to be at the board meeting, whether that be for work-related reasons or just I come from an immigrant family. My family immigrated here from Guyana. I know that there was no way my mother would have ever publicly challenged a building administrator, a board of education, if something had happened to one of us. So I think those are some of when we think about some of the norms, what are the unconscious messages that we send our community? And when we talk about school budgets, a budget is your value system. You determine what it is you value by the budget in which you decide. So if you decide that a bulk of your funding is going to go to services like gifted and talented, which are very good, like gifted and talented services or anything of the sort, and then you don't stop and look, okay, what community have I served there? What students are in these groups? If you create a budget that does not look at that, then you are creating a budget that's going to be riddled with structural bias. So when people have heard me speak at board meetings, a lot of things that I'm speaking on behalf of are ESL communities that are often underserved in our budgets, or the after school or extracurricular programs and tutorings that are often underserved in our budgets, because again, we go back to the social capital, right? Those aren't necessarily the parents that are on the PTA, especially not if you have a PTA that meets during a day. What families have you excluded from being able to take part? And so it's when we think about the idea of structural racism, there's so many little examples we could give, but it's about tearing it out at the root, looking at the root of it, which is why I'm really glad that you started, Rabbi, by saying this is not so much about creating a safe space, because to eradicate racism would take very uncomfortable conversations, and conversations in which all of us, Black and white, take a look at the ways in which we have accessed our privilege, whether that be socioeconomic, whether that be racial privilege, and see what is it that we are willing to sacrifice and what is it that we're willing to leverage.
Well, Petal, before I want to ask, make sure we get to Pastor Richardson, but I do want to just ask you, since you brought it up, could you give maybe one example of something you think we might need to be prepared to give up or think differently about if we're going to seriously challenge some of the bring up or address some of the challenges in education that you brought up, for instance?
I think that, well, there's two very big ones. I think that we need to really consider representation. When we take a look at our school system in Montclair, what does our hiring process look like? We went from a district that had a very diverse teacher population, not leadership, but a very diverse teacher population, to one that is not very diverse, where you could walk into entire departments in some buildings in the high school and see one or no Black teachers whatsoever. That's one. And I think in terms, another one is for representation in the classrooms as the leaders, but representations in the curriculum. I've been saying this for quite some time, but we really, really need to take a real look at our curriculum and decide, are we abolitionist teachers? Are we teaching anti-racism, which is much different than just teaching people to not be racist, but are we actually teaching works that show kids to be anti-racist? Are we is there inclusion in what we're doing? And in order to do that, we really are going to have to start from scratch. We're going to have to take a look at entire courses. We're going to have to take a look at our middle school programs and our middle school curriculums and say, what are the ways that we didn't even realize that the message we were sending was one of oppression? And what are the ways that we can tell full stories of Black experiences?
Thank you. Well, so Pastor Richardson, we've gotten a chance to get just a little snapshot of, very dense snapshot of some of the ways these issues are playing out in our schools, in healthcare, in policing, and in our justice system. You serve as the senior pastor of a very large Black congregation in South Orange. And I'd be interested to hear your reflections on the ways you've seen some or one or a few of those issues playing out and affecting your community.
In terms of systematic racism, so First Baptist Church, that I have the privilege of pastoring for now over 24 years, is the only predominantly African-American church in South Orange. And it has such a rich history, but many people are not aware of that history. The very first people of color to ever come into South Orange were domestic workers, coming from outside of South Orange into South Orange, but they would have to leave at night because they were not allowed to live in the township. When they were finally allowed to live into the township, they were only designated, only several streets were designated for them to live. And they were not allowed to live above a certain street. And so that type of systematic racism, if you will, prevented the church or stifled the church from actually being what the church could be. But over time, we've had so many dynamic men and women that have come through that congregation that have gone on to be movers and shakers around the world. One is an individual that actually roomed with Dr. King. Dr. King would write to the church, as well as Coretta Scott King. The gentleman who gave Dr. Martin Luther King and Andrew Young, the first African-American of Atlanta, the first African-American mayor of Atlanta, the methodology on how to go about dealing with the Montgomery bus issue, which we know today as the Montgomery bus boycott, used to pastor at First Baptist Church. The individual who ended apartheid in South Africa, who came up with the plan to end apartheid in South Africa, was a pastor, former pastor at First Baptist Church of South Orange. And so throughout its history, it's had a rich history, but even to this day, the systemic racism that people of color felt in South Orange still affects the ministry today, because it was only allowed to live on a certain street and exist on a certain street in South Orange. And today it's still on that street. And now in my tenure, where the church has just grown so expeditiously over the past 24 years, variances prevent the church from developing and growing. And so the systematic racism that was back in 1819, ripple effects are still being seen today. And so that's how it's affected in terms of institutionalized racism, if I understand your question correctly. That's how it's currently affecting people of color in South Orange today. We put systems together where we reach outside the community and developed a theological statement that gets us outside the four walls of the church and help us to impact the socioeconomic and political settings of today. And so realizing our rich history, realizing we are, the church has been victim of institutionalized racism, it has not stopped us from taking the charge to be relevant, not just inwardly, but relevant to our community socially, politically, and economically. So we put together outreach programs that will identify and address the socioeconomic and political ills in not just in our town or in the state, but around the world. And we address some of those ills through our ministries, through our outreach ministries. So we've had a great impact. One of the very first, as a matter of fact, the first social outreach initiative I started when I first got there was to accept an invitation to a Holocaust memorial service. It was just an invitation that was sent out to the public. It came across my desk, and I said, we ought to be there. We ought to be there for our Jewish brothers and sisters who we've never met, but who are taking this time to remember a time in their history. And simply because we are part of this community with them. And so it was about 100 of us that just met at the site and just marched with them. And that really opened up a conversation. It opened up a relationship. And since then, I've not missed a Holocaust Memorial Remembrance service. And so the institutionalized racism, actually, we've taken that and we've actually twisted it and turned it around to ask, what can we do in spite of the socioeconomic and political strains and barriers placed up. And so we've just taken our rich history and we just turned it around to use it for our mission and vision and how we see community.
Mm-hmm. I appreciate very profoundly your commitment to be participating in Holocaust remembrance observances. And I want to just share with you that I know that after the shooting in Pittsburgh, part of what was so profound for me and for my congregation was the degree to which people of faith literally showed up at our door to express their solidarity with us. And there were many in the African American church who showed up very specifically to say, we stand with you. We understand that this is an attack on all of us. I guess one of the questions that I have for you at this moment, as we Jews, and in particular we white Jews, are trying to figure out how to be effective allies in combating racism, is how can we best show up? How can we best roll up our sleeves to have impact? What do you think would both be experienced as us standing with you in alliance, in solidarity? What do you think might be required in terms of the work that is ahead of us? And I guess also, are there things that you think we need to be ready to give up, to let go of?
Yeah, so first of all, thank you for the question, Rabbi. It's a very important question, and in some ways it's a very complicated question or complicated answer that I offer. But it has to begin with at least an acknowledgement that the Black and Brown experience in America is different from the white experience. So first of all, I'm saying there's got to be an acknowledgement that our experience is just so different. And many of the panelists today so well articulated that in different ways in which the experience is different. So there must be an acknowledgement that there is disparity that exists. And I think that begins a conversation, an awareness, a conversation that leads to an awareness that leads to a conversation, I want to say. There is a paradigm, what I call paradigm paralysis that happens, that's happened. And we are still having conversation around race. If you look at American history and just simply throughout American history, it was in 2016 that the Times did a Race in America interview with Hillary Clinton at the time. And in that article, she said she just refuses to believe that we cannot find some kind of common ground. I think the common ground first is acknowledging our humanity. And that's what, at least from my perspective, that I was doing when I realized my brothers and sisters, Jewish brothers and sisters who are part of my community, were coming to both celebrate, but also to remember and mourn a past. And I had an opportunity to meet so many individuals and hear their stories. And so I think first and foremost, we need to acknowledge that disparity really does exist, acknowledge that we're in a paradigm that cannot shift because we're paralyzed. And then I think that common ground begins with our very own humanity. Laws that are geared towards reformation, reforming prisons, reforming policing, those are great, but those only last for a period of time. It's more of a tolerance, but true reform or true change can't take place until it first takes place in the individual person. And so bring your humanity is my advice. Bring your humanity and let your humanity lead before your politics, before money, before your social status. So often our humanity has to take a second seat, a back seat to being Republican, being Democratic, being Jewish, being Black, being Hispanic, being brown. But our humanity is what links us. So, Rabbi, complicated question, complicated answer. I just think it begins with the humanity. And because I am a pastor, like Ezekiel was asked a question from God and said, can these bones live again? Can what's dry, what's dead, what's scattered? And that's what our community is today. It's scattered. We're just a scattered humanity. But only one person can answer that question. Ezekiel was the only person that can answer that question. And today we're the only us as individuals can answer the question, do we believe that in this time of disparity, in this time of scattered, or Republican on this side, Democrats on this side, wear masks, do we believe that we can come together and something good can come out of this? And only our humanity can answer that question. So let's go with, it begins with our humanity.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So first of all, I want to remind our listeners that the question and answer panel is open, and it's on the bottom of your screen. It says Q&A. If you have a question, we are probably, after the next maybe 1 or 2 or 3 at the most questions that I ask, going to open it up for questions from our other listeners. So if you're listening and have some questions, please don't hesitate to put them in so we can begin to see what questions are most rising to the top. I do want to give our other panelists a chance to answer the question that I just asked, which is about what does it mean right now for white Jews to be acting in solidarity, to be acting in meaningful alliance, to be allies. What do you think is needed? What do you think is required? And not everybody has to answer, but if maybe one person or two of you want to jump in with a thought, if something arises to your surface.
So I think there are a handful of things that people can do. First off, not everybody comes to the table with the same set of gifts. And there are some people who might be effective advocates on the legislative level. And so working with members of the Assembly and the State Senate, with the governor, may be something where you can have impact. But all of us can do the sort of thing that Pastor Richardson was talking about. I am in a family that in many respects looks like America. 2 of my stepchildren are Jewish, and they are kids that came to me late in life. My wife and I have been married for 6 years, and 2 of our kids, 2 of my children, they went through the Montclair school system, and they have moved through life with me from the time they were born. And what I see in raising this family of now young adults is the importance of proximity, as the pastor was saying. And all of us can figure out a way to get close. Elizabeth Alexander, in a poem called Ars Poetica, asked the question, are we not of interest to each other? And one of the challenges in this moment is that for many Americans, and you can see by the levels of surprise at the homicide video of George Floyd's killing, is that many of us have turned a blind eye for a very, very long time to what has been going on. And so being curious, showing that we are of interest, being present, showing up is one thing that's important. The other is, if to be an ally, you have to be an advocate. That means that, folks like the now unfortunate woman who decided to weaponize Christian Cooper's skin in Central Park, my guess is that was not the first time that she acted in that way. And so being in whether or not it's in the workplace or otherwise, being vigilant for sort of the kind of activity that may be considered by some a microaggression or something that you can just shrug off. But as Petal was making clear, these things can be connected to actually form taking the Ezekiel image again, the bones, the sinew, and the muscle of systemic racism. So calling that out is very important. And then the other thing is look for opportunities to engage and to help people along. One of the things that doesn't mean necessarily engaging from the idea of I'm going to be your savior, because it's very clear that within the Jewish community, there are generations of trauma as well. And I think that if you reach out from a space of shared pain, even over very different things, and shared trauma, that hand over, not out, but that hand over, that joining with, will be received in a much better way.
Yeah, Rabbi, if I can offer more, that was great, and I ditto what Jim shared. You know, we have in our country, it's to see something, say something. It's important, I believe, if we take that concept and speak up and speak out against racist acts. I mean, those acts that we clearly see and we clearly know to be racist. Because to remain silent is to actually advocate for racism. And so being comfortable, it is really uncomfortable, but it's having a determination that myself, I'm here to do something. And so I think it's a speak up, say something, but I also think it's coming to learn my story, get to know my story and help me get to know your story. So whether it's a breaking of bread together, whether it's me attending your event, you attending mine, creating multicultural events where we can come together, or going to and attending multicultural events in community that we can come together. But there's absolutely no way I can get to know you and you can get to know me, or we can combat the fears of what we don't understand and what we don't know about one another if we do not determine that we're going to come together and I want to get to know your story and have you get to know mine.
So thank you. I'm going to give more opportunity for everybody to speak, but I do want to bring up one question that has already come up in the Q&A, and which I suspect is there are at least a good number of listeners who are thinking about. And I want to talk a little bit about the fact that what I think is a stumbling block for many Jewish supporters of Black Lives Matter are statements that are in the Movement for Black Lives platform and have sometimes been stated again more recently by some of the founding members of that movement that describe Israel's relationships to Palestinians as genocidal. And in addition to things like support for BDS are often experienced as instances that at least minimally, and perhaps much more than that, suggest a kind of implicit anti-Semitic bias. And I'm in the spirit of trying to have a brave conversation, and in this spirit of not ignoring what I think some on the call have as a stumbling block, I'd like to see if there's any of you who might want to reflect a little bit on that, or might have something that you think would be helpful for white Jews who are seeking to be allies but are struggling with this question or struggling in this regard. What do we need to understand?
So with being very clear that I don't know all of what was said, but I think there are a couple of important things to note. That saying Black Lives Matter and being part of Black Lives Matter are not the same thing. Black Lives Matter is an actual organization, but to proclaim that Black Lives Matter and to act in anti-racist ways to demonstrate that you believe Black Lives Matter, it is not one and the same. And I say that to say you don't necessarily have to throw the baby out with the bathwater, right? So like I can be critical of American policy, but that does not make me anti-American. That does not, the best example that I could give is I could support the ideas of Malcolm X without joining the Nation of Islam, meaning that I can still walk in that struggle. I can still fight that anti-racism fight. The Nation of Islam is a separate thing. And I think just as we think about this question, it's important that we recognize that Black Lives Matter and the leaders of that group, that's an actual organization. But just to say that we believe in Black Lives Matter and work towards being anti-racist, that doesn't necessarily make you part of that organization. That means that you have decided to work towards anti-racism. So while I definitely, unfortunately, Rob, I don't have a specific answer to that question, what I can say is that your feelings about the organization should not halt your work towards making sure that Black lives matter in every aspect, whether that be health, education, policing, and everything else.
I'm just giving a second in case anybody else wants to add to that question. And I don't want to get stuck on it for too long, because I do know that as Jews, we sometimes, when we start talking about race, want to also talk about anti-Semitism, and I want to leave most of this conversation for discussing racism. But if anybody else does want to add a word, I just want to give a minute, and then we're going to move on to some other questions.
Well, I can offer this one thought. I think in anytime we're setting up alliances, there are times when we are disappointed with our allies and disappointed with positions that they've taken, and sometimes object to them vehemently. It happens sometimes within racial groups. If you look at the civil rights movement, you would not find a complete alignment between the Southern Christian Leadership Organization, the NAACP, and other groups. There was disagreements over tactics, disagreements over even things that were said. There are sometimes things where some of our allies are actually saying things that are hurtful and might be fairly described as anti-Semitic. Just as I talked about the issue of when we hear something, we should say something. You know, I think it applies across the board, and we have to be very clear about what we're for and what we consider problematic. It is a stumbling block, but I don't think it should be a dead end because we need to move forward in ways in which there are going to be disagreements. The other thing I would say is this, you know, I would wish that many of folks who are who think they know the answers about Israel would actually travel there, would spend some time there, and understand that it's a very, very complex situation that needs to be improved for sure. But again, by getting proximate, you can get a better understanding of what is happening there and a deeper understanding of the trauma that exists there and enable us to better move forward together.
I want to really thank you for that. I think that I've often counseled people in my community who are struggling with issues about Israel to go there, because I think once you're there, what is flat and two-dimensional becomes three-dimensional, and the complexity that it adds also adds clarity. And I think that in my own experience, I think the kind of proximity you're discussing is is also perhaps a recommendation that I might make to the Jewish community in terms of understanding and issues of Black lives and working with Black Lives Matter movements, not necessarily the movement, but those movements. And I think that in my experience, when I show up and I'm in the same room, in particular in my experience with African-American clergy, the issues really take on a different dimension, and whether or not there might be places of disagreement fades as we have an opportunity to notice the places of agreement, but also as I have an opportunity to notice that often, not always, but often there's a disparity even in the architecture of the buildings where African Americans are meeting in church versus the buildings where white Jews are meeting for synagogue. Never mind, in many cases, the block or the town where those congregations sit. So I think that, I don't know if everybody else on the call would agree, but I would offer that suggestion of making ourselves proximate, of being in relationship, of being in neighborhoods of African Americans is one of the most valuable things we can do to begin to open our eyes to some of the realities that are different there than we might be experiencing in perhaps mostly white or dominant white neighborhoods.
I would agree, Rabbi. I think the proximity is so important. I think we really, as Pastor Richardson said, we really have to get to know one another. Have more in common than not. We just sometimes, it feels like, haven't taken the time to get to those spaces. And so I would really say that we should find the common ground, and we should not live as insulated as we do sometimes. And so, you know, to hear of the times that you spend with other clergy, I think is really important. But I think we have to really look to get to know one another. When you talked about the differences in architecture, it got me thinking to the social determinants of health. You know, all of the things I talked about earlier, where it's not just about access, it's about everything else. Housing, Petal talked about education, you know, economic development. We're not starting at the same place. And so we end up at different outcomes. And then I think when you factor on just racism and the chronic stress, in addition to all of those things, you really get to really poor outcomes. You know, one of the things that I say is this is a watershed moment, because I think, as Jim said, it can't just be our issue. It has to be everybody's issue. We all have to see that this is unjust, and we all sort of have to demand better from all of the systems. You know, one of the examples I was talking to somebody about was Walmart, and a couple of the big stores had to stop a couple practices that they had in place where they would lock Black hair products behind sort of locked drawers or shelves. And so in order to go and get $2 shampoo or a 50-cent comb, you'd have to go and ask for permission to see the item so that you could purchase the item. What does that mean? When somebody asked them about it and sort of said, why would you do that? They said, you know, some of these items disappear. And then when they asked them for the documentation, sort of the paper trail on how this was true or not, there was no paper trail. And so I think these are just the simple things that folks may not know, but this is the kind of aggravation that when you begin to experience this over a lifetime, really can lead you to poor outcomes. So I think we have to be able to have these conversations. They're not always comfortable, but I think they're necessary. And I think we really have to be able to empathize and understand that our experiences are different because of our race. And I think that Black Lives Matter is really to really talk about the fact that we do matter. The things that have been happening to us have just not been just.
Thank you.
I can just go back to proximity real quick, Rabbi, and give an example. So I was bused in middle school 15 miles from my home. I grew up in a suburban area. And during that time of busting in the 70s, Black communities were bused to white schools. And it was a 15-mile trip, which lasted, of course, anywhere from 45 minutes to an hour, rush hour in the morning, and then rush hour in the evening. And so what was interesting is no white communities were bused into Black cities. By the time we got home from school, the white kids were already doing their homework or doing their after-school activities. I would get home no earlier than 7 o'clock at night. And so now I have to start homework and get something to eat and so on and so forth. So that's just an example of how proximity is important and meaningful, because Blacks were bused from a suburban community into a white suburban community, and we learned that culture, but it was never reversed. It was never reversed during that busing season in the 70s, where white families or white school systems, white children were bused into Black communities. And so learning of Black culture was never afforded during those times. And so when you, Rabbi, talk about the difference between the worship space, for example, my sanctuary, I have a large church. My sanctuary sits 150 seats. I've had over 2,000 people join my ministry since 24 years I've been there. But because we have been now landlocked in, because we were only told we could live or exist in that area, when the church now needs to grow, needs space, room to grow, there's no land available, and we are subjected to ordinances that are for businesses, because the church was only allowed to exist in the business development or business zone. So we can't expand and grow for the reason that we're landlocked, and we're restricted to ordinances that's based on the business zone. whereas other faith institutions are not. So they can grow as high as they want, as wide as they want, and can own as much land as that's to them. So that's just an example of proximity.
Thank you.
Yeah.
You know, Petal, especially after just hearing from Pastor Richardson talk about his experience with busing, as teachers and children are preparing to return to school in the fall, we hope in some regard, likely from what we've been hearing, shortened days or fewer days a week. I'm wondering if you might think about any lessons that have been learned and any places where we might want to be giving special attention to make sure that our return back to school during this time of pandemic is an anti-racist return back to school, is a return back to school that doesn't reinstitute systems that that include racial bias.
So I think when we think about the return back to school, that's a good question. We not only have to consider the racial bias, but also our socioeconomic bias. I think sometimes we make assumptions based upon the life we live, right? So we assume, okay, if I need masks, I'll buy a set of masks. I'll buy a set of 10 masks so that my child could have a mask to go to school every day, and just in case they lose one, right? We never give consideration to families that I have spoken to who take turns leaving because there's only but so many masks among them, right? And those are the little things. That's a little safety factor that goes in. What about the family that has children in more than one location? So we sent a survey home to parents that said, how comfortable are you with the way your child gets to school? How comfortable were you before? How comfortable will you be after? Well, that's a really, that question's a little bit unfocused, right? So if we think about it, if I'm driving my child to school because I can every morning, then I'm gonna check off, yeah, I'm very comfortable. And then the district will see that 50% of the people can drive their child to school every morning, and they'll make accommodations and will make decisions about reopening around that. And I think that we have to take into consideration who's taking our surveys, and what is guiding some of those responses to the survey. So if we want to be careful about paying attention to people of all socioeconomic levels, as well as being mindful of students of color, we have to make sure that we have representatives at the table when those discussions are had, meaning that you would need representatives from the community. You would absolutely have to have representatives from the association. So you have teachers at the table that can tell you what they faced every single day while we were facing COVID. We have to factor in certain things. Like we have people that say, well, all instruction should be live instruction, but do we consider access, right? We send a Chromebook home with the family, but what about the family that has more than one child? What about the family that has no place in their house that is a quiet space, or a space that they want their class to enter in? See, what we're doing right now, we have all found a space in which we're comfortable with people seeing into our homes. We don't know that that's the case for every child. So I think when we think about a return to school, it's the devil will be in the details. It's in all of those little things that sometimes we take for granted, especially health-wise, whether it be sanitizer, mask access, getting to and from school. And this is whether you decide to open or close, right? Not everyone has a parent that can work from home. So how will we ensure that those students, if we do have to go to this hybrid, how will we ensure that they're still accessing their education? How are we going to ensure that people are still accessing their accommodations? And then there are other aspects to school that have nothing to do with academics, just the socialization aspect of school. And we're keeping in mind that for all children, home is not always a safe space. For some children, school is where you get heat. School is where you get food. And keeping all of those things in mind and making sure that we keep our entire community in mind when we make decisions about the reopening.
Rabbi, can I just emphasize one?
Yeah,
it was
please.
so rich what she had to say.
Yeah.
But there are two things that go into what can we do. Petal made the point about certain voices not being at the table. And so anytime you are in a position of power and you're going into a meeting, one of the questions you should be asking if you really want to be an ally is, who's not here that should be here? And if there isn't a way to bring them in, then the next question is, and if they were here, what would they say? And I will transmit that voice. I don't believe people are voiceless. I believe that there are certain voices that you just aren't listened to. And so if you have a platform, ask, who isn't here that shouldn't be here? And if I can't get them in, what would they say? And the other point, really important point, is the intersectionality between race and economics. I was, for about 1.5 years, special counsel in Atlantic City for Governor Murphy. And one of the questions became, well, there's an issue here with kids not having enough to do after school. And there's not a lot of adult supervision after school. Well, then when we dug deeper, we found out that what was happening in Atlantic City was that 1 in 3 households had someone leaving home for work after noon, as opposed in the rest of the state when it was only 1 in 10, which meant that the adults were out of the community and unable to care for kids. So dig deep, try to really understand deeply problems. And that's an example, a structural issue that you wouldn't necessarily pin structural racism on it, but from a class perspective, it's a big challenge.
Well, thank you. Both of you actually went where I wanted to close with. I want to, first of all, note we've had far more questions than I've been able to get to. And even just trying to keep them going in the corner of my eye has been tough. So I really am grateful for your being here and for your patience. But I do, since we are getting close to wrapping up, probably in the next, I don't know what, I've lost track of the time, but let's just say 7 or 8 minutes. I'm really interested to hear more comments like what we just heard from Jim about specific things that we should be thinking about doing. If we are ready to be allies, even if we can't yet get to the long-term vision, what are the things that we should be emphasizing that are steps that we can take now? Are there steps that our congregation should be thinking about? Are there steps that we as individuals should be thinking about? And I also just want to leave space in case there's something that hasn't been said that you want to take this opportunity to say that you feel like is an important thing in terms of thinking about how the Jewish community can really, in an authentic way, join as allies in the effort to be anti-racist. So I leave that open for whoever wants to jump in. And because we do have a little bit of time, I invite you to maybe think about, I don't know, 60-second answers. Shorter if you want, we'll get to more people.
Rabbi, I was thinking of this. I was attempting to address some questions privately. And the last question I was addressing is, I thought of one of the ways we can do this is to form let's do a campaign together. It's possible we can just put a statement, a short statement together, or a saying together, a tag phrase together, tagline together, and make that a campaign in our community. For example, Black Lives Matter, but make some kind of statement. Just, we can come together, be creative. What kind of statement can we make? Make it a public campaign, a community campaign that can even go further than that. It can even become a national campaign. So one way is simply we can work together, come together, put our brains together, put a statement together, and create a campaign.
I want to just echo that. I think I'll just share one brief experience of mine that here in Montclair, after an incident of anti-Semitism, there was some real soul searching and connection between Jewish and African-American clergy in town. And we decided that part of what needed to happen was for us to join a campaign, and we worked together on a campaign for rent control in Montclair. And it was transformational to have that project that we could be dedicated to together. So thank you.
Rabbi, I was there with you.
You were awesome.
I was the Havana is from my congregation.
Oh, that's awesome. That's great.
Right. So I was there at one of the public meetings, by the way.
Thank you. Well, the power of doing something together in a campaign is further iterated. So other ideas about some steps that we should be taking, that we should be addressing first, next steps.
So
I would
go ahead.
go ahead. Okay, I would say just walk with me. I really, I heard Jim's comments about hear what the plight is and speak up for me when I'm not there. So I feel it's something as simple as sort of walk with me, take the story and share it. Don't just talk to me when you're with me, but really walk with me and stay with me when you go to where you're going. I think another thing I heard Jim say earlier was we all have gifts and talents. Mine are different than yours, and Petals are different than pastors, and we all have different skills and talents. But I feel like if we come together, we can share them and we can really look to find solutions together. And so I know the Jewish Federation of Women has reached out to some folks that I know has taken a real interest in maternal mortality in terms of what can they do to help. We have community doulas, we have different initiatives. I think we need to share them with you. I think you should walk with us because I think together we can kind of come up with solutions. So it seems so simple to say, but it's deep because it really means that you hear my plight. You're a human being, I'm a human being, but I can count on you to represent me in places that I'm not, and I feel like this whole Black Lives Matter protests and movement are very diverse and really include many different people, and we need to see more of that. So mine would be as simple as just walk with me.
Thank you. Petal, it seemed like you were going to jump in with a couple last thoughts on that.
Lisa said so much of what I was going to say, and I agree with every word of it. There's an African saying I used to teach in AFM Lit that says, "A story is story, let it go, let it come." So you did the first step. We let our stories go, and you retell it, allow it to come back, and I think advocate in those spaces in which you don't see where we are not. In those areas in which we don't have access, continue that advocacy and ensure that we're not living in the moment, but we are all participants in the movement of it. And so when you do have access, utilize all of your social capital to continue advocacy for our students of color. And that would be my best suggestion. Like Lisa said, do it right now. Speak with me, speak for me when I'm not present, and help bring us into those spaces in which we are not. Look around this room and recognize, does this room have representation? And if it doesn't, be the one to speak up on behalf of representation and demand that it's there.
I can be really short. I would say this. One, remember, justice isn't a concept, it's actually a practice. And for us to get good at it, we have to practice it all the time. You can't read a book and lose weight. You have to change your habits. Two, I would say we haven't talked about this, but I think that we have as a community, one of the things that holds us together is a sense of love. And we shouldn't be afraid of actually expressing that even in the public space, square. Bobby Kennedy is over this shoulder. Frederick Douglass and Desmond Tutu are over there. When Martin Luther King was killed, he talked about the power of love and the importance of love. One of the last politicians to talk about that as part of an anchoring statement. And it's just coincidental that this picture is here. It was taken by the grandparent of kids that grew up in Montclair. She used her talents. She was in 1964, mother raising her daughters on the Upper West Side, who decided that she was going to travel down the Mississippi and take photographs of the Freedom Riders and also the Mississippi Freedom Summer. She took photographs like this of Bobby Kennedy. But folks who had seen her in '63 would have said, "You're just a photographer. You don't really have any particular talent." But she used what she had, and she left an indelible mark. If each of us uses what we have, if each of us practices justice, not just talks about it, we can make a tremendous amount of difference at this time. Tremendous difference.
Really want to, again, thank all of our panelists. This has been a tremendous opportunity for me, and I trust for all of the listeners. I want to add to the last words of that you just shared, Jim, that, I've never been accused as a rabbi of being afraid to talk about justice, but I've actually found it much more useful over time to talk about love. And I think when we work and to enact love in our community and enact love for other people, the justice often follows in that practice. So thank you very much to everybody. I want to note just what a great opportunity it has been for us to hear from you, and what a tremendous gift it was for you to spend your time with us and to share your thoughts. And I want to throw this conversation back to Sherry before we completely wrap up.
Thank you, Rabbi, and thank you to our wonderful panelists for really having a discussion that needed to take place and very enlightening for all of us. This is the second in a series of events to educate our community on the issue of systemic racism in America. Our Jewish Federation's response, however, will include an action plan that goes beyond these educational webinars. Scott Krieger and Leslie Dannon Rosenthal, two past presidents of our Jewish Federation, are chairing this effort, which will include ways for our community to get involved and make a difference. Our professionals are working collaboratively across department lines and working with our early childhood centers, synagogues, and agencies to make the issue of social justice, civil rights, and repairing the world something that's present and ongoing. So please stay tuned for the date of our third webinar, Making a Difference, and check our website, www.jfedgmw.org. It should be on the screen now, for a list of all our amazing programs this summer. On behalf of the Jewish Federation of Greater Metro West, thank you again for joining us, and good night. Thank you.
Okie doke.
Thank you all.
Thank you. It was wonderful.